Kenji Nakamura was the richest man on the rooftop terrace of the Plaza Hotel that July evening in New York City, but also the loneliest. 38 years old, worth $200 million, founder of a Japanese tech multinational. Yet he stood by the railing, isolated, while hundreds of Manhattan elite laughed and toasted around him. Nobody talked to him. Nobody dared approach the mysterious Asian tycoon who never smiled. Then, at the most awkward moment of the evening, when the host announced the opening dance and everyone searched for their partners, the unthinkable happened. A young waitress of 26, Chen, whom everyone considered just the girl who serves champagne, crossed the illuminated terrace, stopped in front of him, and in perfect, respectful Japanese, asked if he would grant her the honor of a dance. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Kenji did something no one had ever seen him do. He smiled. And what happened on that night of stars and twinkling lights would change two lives forever, proving that sometimes the courage to cross a terrace is worth more than any fortune. The rooftop terrace of the Plaza Hotel was Manhattan's jewel, 20 stories up. Breathtaking view of Central Park illuminated below. String lights suspended like artificial stars. Elegant tables arranged among tropical plants and champagne fountains. That July evening hosted the year's most exclusive charity gala. 300 guests from New York's high society. Shimmering evening gowns. Jewelry worth more than penthouses. Whispered conversations over glasses of cristal. Kenji Nakamura leaned against the marble railing, his Armani black suit perfect, his gray silk tie knotted with millimeter precision. His dark eyes observed the crowd with an impenetrable expression. At 38, he was one of Japan's most successful tech entrepreneurs. His company, Nakatech, was worth over $2 billion. He was in New York to negotiate the acquisition of an American artificial intelligence startup. But that evening, surrounded by hundreds of people, he felt completely alone. The problem wasn't language. Kenji spoke perfect English, studied at Stanford. The problem was something more subtle, more painful. It was the invisible wall that formed around him every time he entered a room full of Westerners. He saw in their eyes that mixture of curiosity and distrust. They looked at him like an exotic object, not a person. Some attempted superficial conversations, but the words were empty, formal, full of stereotypes about geishas and samurai. Nobody truly tried to know him, to understand who he was beyond his wealth, beyond the slight accent, beyond the Asian features that seemed to automatically make him different in the eyes of that crowd of elegant New Yorkers. So, Kenji did what he always did in these situations, retreated into his shell, responded with polite monosyllables, maintained a courteous but cold distance, and inside he felt terribly, painfully alone. Chen had noticed him as soon as he arrived. She'd worked as an events waitress at the Plaza Hotel for 2 years, while finishing her degree in East Asian languages at Columbia. It was her way of paying for school after her father, a restaurant worker, had died, leaving the family without resources. 26 years old, brown hair pulled into an elegant chignon, impeccable black uniform and white shirt, Emma moved among the guests with professional grace, offering champagne and salmon canapes. But her eyes kept returning to that solitary Japanese man by the railing. There was something in his body language she recognized. Loneliness, isolation, the feeling of being a stranger in a place that should be festive. Emma had lived it too, in different ways. When she was the only one from her working-class neighborhood to attend an Ivy League university. When her wealthy classmates looked down on her for her Queen's accent and discount clothes. But there was another reason Emma couldn't look away from Kenji. She'd spent the last 4 years studying Japanese with obsessive passion. The culture, the language, the literature. She'd even lived 6 months in Tokyo on a scholarship, working in a small restaurant to support herself. She spoke Japanese fluently. She knew the subtle levels of respect built into the language, the cultural gestures, the nuances few Westerners caught. And seeing that Japanese man so visibly uncomfortable in the New York crowd, she felt a growing impulse. The evening proceeded with its program. The host, a Manhattan real estate mogul, climbed onto the small stage set up on the terrace. He thanked the guests, spoke about the charitable cause, a children's hospital, then announced it was time for the traditional opening dance. The live orchestra struck up a Viennese waltz. Couples began to form, elegant men offering their arms to glittering ladies. Laughter, chatter, the rustle of evening gowns as they moved toward the improvised dance floor at the terrace center. Kenji remained where he was, knowing no one would invite him. No one would approach. He watched the couples dance under the string lights and for a moment let the mask of indifference fall. His eyes reflected a deep, ancient sadness, that of someone who has everything except what truly matters. It was in that moment that Emma made the bravest decision of her life. She set down her tray on a table, removed her black waitress apron, revealing just the white shirt and black skirt that could pass for formal attire, and crossed the terrace. Her colleagues watched in amazement. What was she doing? Waitresses didn't mix with guests. It was an iron rule. She could be fired on the spot. But Emma kept walking, heart pounding, until she stopped in front of Kenji Nakamura. He turned, surprised to find someone so close. And then Emma did something extraordinary. With a respectful bow, exactly the correct angle for addressing a social superior in Japan, she spoke in formal, perfect Japanese. Time seemed to stop. Kenji stared at her with eyes slowly widening, disbelief crossing his face. This Italian waitress, on this New York terrace, was speaking his language with a fluency and cultural respect he'd never encountered in the West. For the first time in years, Kenji Nakamura felt something break inside him. The wall of ice, the armor of loneliness, and before he even realized it, a smile, genuine, warm, incredulous, formed on his face. Kenji looked at Emma as if she'd appeared from nowhere, an unexpected miracle on a night he'd already catalogued as yet another evening of gilded isolation. Her words in Japanese still resonated in the air, perfect not just in pronunciation, but in tone, in the level of respect, in the choice of appropriate verb forms. He responded in Japanese, his voice slightly hoarse with sudden emotion. He asked if she really spoke his language or if it was a memorized phrase. Emma smiled, answering that she'd studied Japanese at university, that she'd lived in Tokyo, that she loved the culture and language more than anything else. As they spoke in Japanese, unaware that the crowd around them had noticed the unusual scene, Kenji felt something he hadn't experienced in years: connection. This young woman wasn't looking at him as a mysterious millionaire or an exotic foreigner. She looked at him as a person, and she spoke with him in his mother tongue, which meant something deeply intimate for someone who lived constantly in translation. Emma had noticed the change in his face. The cold mask had disappeared. In its place was vulnerability, surprise, something that looked like gratitude. She realized how difficult it must be for him to navigate these Western events alone. Always foreign, always observed, but never truly seen. Then Kenji did something impulsive, something completely out of character. With an elegant gesture and formal Japanese, he asked if she would grant him the honor of this dance. Emma felt her breath catch. She knew she was breaking every rule. Waitresses didn't dance with guests. Her boss, Mr. Harrison, was already glaring at her from across the terrace. She could be fired. She could lose the job she desperately needed. But looking into Kenji's eyes, seeing the fragile hope that had ignited there, she couldn't say no. With a bow that accepted the invitation in the traditional Japanese way, she placed her hand in his. As they walked toward the dance floor, a murmur crossed the crowd. Who was that waitress? How dare she? Some elderly ladies whispered, scandalized. Some businessmen smiled, amused. But Kenji and Emma didn't hear them. They were already in their world, isolated from the rest. The orchestra was playing a slow, romantic waltz. Kenji placed a hand on Emma's waist, with the delicacy of someone handling something precious. She placed her hand on his shoulder, and they began to move. Emma wasn't an expert dancer, but Kenji led with surprising confidence. They moved among the other couples, and as they danced, they continued speaking in Japanese. Kenji asked about her life, her studies. Emma told him about her worker father who had died, her mother who worked as a cleaning lady, her scholarship to Tokyo. And Kenji, for the first time in years, opened up. He spoke of the loneliness of always being the Japanese man in the room, of how success had isolated him even more, of how he felt he'd lost connection with anything real while building his tech empire. The words flowed in Japanese, a language that allowed an emotional depth Kenji struggled to express in English. Emma listened, truly listened, nodding, asking questions, sharing her own vulnerabilities in turn. The music ended too soon, but when the orchestra struck up a new melody, Kenji didn't let Emma go. They continued to dance, song after song, lost in their bubble of Japanese and authentic connection. Mr. Harrison, Emma's boss, approached with a furious expression during a musical break. He grabbed Emma's arm, telling her in a low but angry tone that she had to return to work immediately, that her behavior was unacceptable, that they would talk after the evening. But Kenji, seeing the fear in Emma's eyes, did something unexpected. With his calm but authoritative voice, he addressed Harrison in halting but clear English, saying that the young lady was his personal guest for the evening, that he had invited her, and that if there was any problem, he would be pleased to discuss it with the hotel management. The tone left no room for discussion. Harrison, recognizing he was speaking with one of the most important and wealthy guests at the event, retreated with a stiff bow, but his eyes sent daggers toward Emma. Emma knew she would pay for this, but in that moment, looking at Kenji, who had defended her with that gentle determination, she didn't care. As the evening continued, Kenji and Emma retreated to a quieter corner of the terrace. They sat at a secluded table, overlooking illuminated Manhattan spreading below them.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
A waiter brought champagne, but Kenji asked for green tea instead. Emma ordered the same in perfect Japanese. They talked for hours. Kenji told of his childhood in Kyoto, of Stanford University, where he'd always felt divided between two worlds, of the rapid success that had made him rich but terribly alone, of how he'd always been too Western for Japan and too Japanese for the West. Emma shared her story, her father's death, the family's financial collapse, the decision to continue university while working nights, the scholarship to Tokyo where she'd fallen in love with an entire culture. Kenji looked at her with eyes that shone with something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition, the feeling of being seen, understood, accepted. Hours passed like minutes. Guests left. The orchestra stopped playing, but they continued talking in a mix of Japanese and English. When the terrace was nearly empty, Kenji asked if they could see each other again. Emma felt something tighten in her chest. She wanted to say yes, but there was reality. She was a poor student. He was a billionaire who would leave soon. Impossibly distant worlds. But Kenji pulled out his phone, showing his calendar. He'd canceled all appointments for the following week. He wanted to stay in New York, spend time with her, see the city through her eyes. He said in Japanese something profound, that he'd spent 10 years chasing success and forgotten how to live, but that in a few hours with her, he'd felt more life than he'd experienced in years. The 7 days that followed were magical in a way neither could have predicted. Kenji kept his promise. He canceled meetings, ignored urgent calls, let his assistants handle emergencies. For the first time in 10 years, he put life before work. Emma became his personal guide to New York. Not tourist New York, but her New York. The food market in Queens, where her mother bought vegetables. The diner in Brooklyn, where her father took her for birthdays. The Columbia Library, where she spent entire nights studying Japanese kanji. Kenji saw the city with new eyes. Not five-star hotel suites and Michelin restaurants, but real life. They ate hot dogs standing in Central Park. They drank coffee at corner bodega counters. They walked for hours through neighborhoods no guidebook mentioned. And they talked. Hours and hours of conversations that flowed from Japanese to English, from deep topics to silly things, from comfortable silences to sudden laughter. Kenji discovered Emma loved classic Japanese literature, could recite Basho's poetry by heart. Emma discovered Kenji, behind his cold businessman facade, was incredibly funny, did terrible celebrity impressions, had a hidden passion for New York pizza. But they also discovered deeper things. Kenji confessed he'd never had a real relationship, that the few women he'd been with were only interested in his status. Emma confessed she'd closed herself off after her father's death, that she'd never let anyone in for fear of losing someone she loved again. On the fifth day, Kenji took her somewhere special, the Japanese garden in Brooklyn Botanic. It was a small corner of Japan transplanted to New York, with a koi pond, red bridges, stone lanterns. It was nearly empty that July afternoon. They sat on a bench by the water. Kenji took Emma's hand, something he'd never dared do before. He told her, in formal Japanese, that betrayed how important what he was about to say was, that in 5 days he'd felt more connection with her than he'd experienced in his entire life. Emma felt tears fill her eyes. She responded that she felt the same, but that she was afraid. Afraid it was just a dream, that he would return to Japan, that she'd be left with a broken heart. Kenji looked at her with serious intensity. He said he didn't want to go back to Japan. Not yet. He said he wanted to see where this would take them. Whatever it was. He said that, for the first time, he understood what it meant to want to be with someone, not out of duty or convenience, but because, without that person, the world seemed less colorful. They kissed there, under the cherry trees that weren't in bloom, while koi swam in the pond, and New York hummed in the distance. It was a sweet kiss, hesitant, loaded with unspoken promises. But dreams, however beautiful, must face reality. And reality knocked on the door on the 8th day, in the form of a call from the Tokyo office. Kenji received the news while having breakfast with Emma at a cafe near the Flatiron Building. His executive vice president called with a tense voice. There was a crisis. A major investor threatened to withdraw if Kenji didn't return immediately to personally handle negotiations. The company could lose $50 million. Emma saw his face change as he listened. The carefree joy of the past week froze, replaced by tension and responsibility. When he hung up, Kenji suddenly seemed aged. He had to return to Tokyo. The flight would leave that evening. He'd tried to negotiate, but the investor was adamant. Either Kenji returned, or the deal fell through. Emma felt something break inside. She'd known this would happen, but hoping and knowing are different things. She smiled bravely, saying she understood, that of course he had to go. But Kenji took her hands across the cafe table. With a firm voice, he said, this wasn't the end. He asked her to wait for him, to give him time to settle things in Tokyo. Then he would return. Or better yet, she could come to Japan. She could work for his company as a cultural consultant, use her degree in East Asian languages. Emma wanted to believe him. She desperately wanted to believe him. But she'd seen too many movies, read too many books. She knew how these stories ended. The prince returns to his castle. The common girl stays in her ordinary life. Distance and reality erode promises made under New York stars. But Kenji insisted. He pulled out his phone and booked a ticket for Emma to Tokyo for 2 weeks later. He gave her his company address, personal number, private email. He made her promise she'd come. They spent the last hours together walking through Manhattan. They didn't talk much. They held hands tightly, as if they could stop time with the strength of their grip. When it was time for Kenji to go to the airport, they hugged so hard it hurt. Kenji whispered in Japanese that he loved her. They were words he'd never said to anyone. Emma responded the same way, her voice broken by tears. Then he left, and Emma stood on the street, watching the car disappear into New York traffic, wondering if she'd just lived the best week of her life or the prelude to the worst pain. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of Emma's life. Kenji called every day, texted constantly, but there was always something. Negotiations got complicated. New crises emerged. The return to New York he'd promised kept getting delayed. Emma began to doubt. Maybe she'd been naive. Maybe Kenji, back in his world of billions and power, had realized how absurd the idea of a relationship with a waitress student was. Maybe the words of love had been sincere in that moment, but evaporated facing reality. But then the ticket arrived. Kenji hadn't canceled it. In fact, he'd upgraded it to business class, booked an apartment for her in Tokyo, organized everything. Now he was just waiting for her to find the courage to use it. Emma looked at the ticket for days. Going to Japan meant leaving New York, her studies, her job, everything she knew. What if she arrived and discovered it had all been a mistake? What if the magic of that week didn't survive the light of ordinary day? It was her mother who gave her the decisive advice. The woman who'd worked her whole life cleaning houses of rich people, who'd raised Emma alone after her husband's death, looked her in the eyes and said something simple but profound. Regret for things not done hurts more than pain from things tried. Emma took the plane. 14 hours of flight, during which she oscillated between excitement and terror. When she landed in Tokyo, her legs trembled as she walked through Narita Airport. Kenji was waiting at arrivals. When their eyes met across the crowd, all doubt vanished. He was there. He'd kept his promise. They embraced without words. And Emma knew. She knew this wasn't a dream about to end. It was something real just beginning. In the months that followed, they built something unique. Emma really did work for Nakatech, using her cultural knowledge to help the company expand in America. But most importantly, they built a life together. A life that mixed cultures, languages, worlds. It wasn't always easy. There were cultural challenges, differences, moments of misunderstanding, but they had something many couples never have. They'd started with authenticity. They'd chosen each other not for convenience or expectations, but because in the middle of a terrace full of people, two lonely souls had recognized each other. 2 years later, Kenji brought Emma back to New York, to the same Plaza Hotel rooftop terrace. He'd rented the entire space just for them. The string lights shone like that first night. The orchestra played the same waltz. And there, under the Manhattan stars, Kenji knelt and asked Emma to marry him. In perfect Japanese, with all the appropriate forms of respect, but also with the simplest words that exist. I love you. Emma said yes. She would have said yes in any language. The wedding was a celebration of two worlds. Shinto ceremony in Kyoto, American reception in Brooklyn. Japanese guests learning to toast cheers, Americans attempting respectful bows, two cultures merging into something new and beautiful, and all because a young waitress had the courage to cross a terrace and speak Japanese to a lonely millionaire, because she'd seen beyond the bank account and the facade of success, recognizing a kindred soul in isolation. Years passed. Kenji and Emma built a life between Tokyo and New York, raising bilingual and bicultural children. Nakatech opened offices in America. Emma wrote books on intercultural communication. They became a living example of how love crosses not just languages, but entire worlds. And every year, on the anniversary of that first night, they returned to the Plaza Hotel rooftop terrace. They danced under the same string lights, remembering the moment when everything changed. Because sometimes the courage to say hello in a foreign language is worth more than any fortune. Sometimes a dance changes two lives, and sometimes, just sometimes, modern fairy tales really happen. Not because a prince saves a girl, but because two lonely people save each other. Like if you believe true love crosses languages and cultures, comment if you've ever found connection in an unexpected moment. Share this story of courage, transformed loneliness, and love that overcomes worlds. Subscribe for more stories proving magic still exists. Sometimes the richest person in the room is the poorest in human connection. And sometimes it just takes someone brave enough to cross a terrace, speak a foreign language, and see the soul behind the facade. Because true love knows no boundaries, not of language, culture, or social class. It only knows the courage of two hearts that recognize each other.